Welcome, everyone. We are live with another episode of Level Up Law, where every Tuesday at noon, South Carolina Legal Services levels up your legal knowledge about an area of law that we practice in here. I'm Senior Staff Attorney Susan Ingalls here in our Greenville office, and I'm here with producer Kenneth Elliott, who is assisting us in the background. You are viewing Attorney Sheila Thomas, who is our Managing Attorney of the office in Orangeburg, South Carolina for legal services. Today, Sheila is going to be discussing the process of getting a delayed birth certificate in South Carolina, what that means and how it's done. But before we get started, we do want you to know this is not legal advice. It's just general information for you, the public. If you need the help of a lawyer on this or other matters, call our intake line here at South Carolina Legal Services, or you can apply online. All of that information on how to do that will be provided at the end of today's presentation. Also, as a reminder, all of our episodes are posted by our producer Kenneth Elliott to the Level Up Law playlist on our YouTube channel, usually within about 24 hours. Now, our presenters can answer general questions. If there is time at the conclusion of today's presentation, Ms. Thomas will do that. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the question box and we will have a look at those and see if we can get some answers for you at the end of the presentation. Again, we will post a recording of today's episode on our YouTube channel, and be sure to check out our social media, like, subscribe, and get all the up-to-date information that we provide on our Level Up Law show, as well as other resources that we have here at Legal Services. Those websites and social media handles can be found again on the last slide in Sheila's presentation today. So thanks for being with us, Sheila. Take it away on getting a delayed birth certificate in South Carolina. Be sure and unmute yourself.
There we go. Can everyone hear me? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you all for coming. This is a legal topic that a lot of people may not be familiar with, which would be surprising because there are lots of people who are affected by this issue. The presentation that I'm doing is on how to obtain a delayed birth certificate in South Carolina. And I'll explain a little bit about what that is as I go through the presentation. But in essence, there are people who live in South Carolina whose birth is not registered. So there's no record of their birth at the DHEC Vital Records Agency with the State Registrar. And that can happen for a number of reasons. Typically, this was beyond the control of the person who's in this position. So the next time you hear, and it's associated with an inability to get a photo ID. So when you hear someone say, the next time you hear it in general conversation or on television, how hard is it to go get an ID? Well, it's super hard when you don't have a birth certificate. And there are possibly millions of people throughout the country, primarily in the South, who do not have birth certificates. Their birth was just never registered. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Yeah, back in 2006, the Brennan Center at the Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law did a survey and a study to try to estimate the amount of people who in the country who did not have a birth certificate. I suspect that maybe their research was related to voting, but quite honestly, the primary issue for the people in this situation is that they cannot usually access basic services and benefits like housing, Social Security benefits, medical care, because they don't have an ID and they don't have a birth certificate, so they can't get an ID. And an ID is required for a lot of these just very personal things that they need to accomplish. What these people are lacking, basically, because this is essentially what your birth certificate provides, is documentation that you're a citizen of the United States and a resident of the state of South Carolina. The most common form of the document that's missing is the birth certificate. And surprisingly, a lot of people who have this issue are, for most of their lives, are not aware that they don't have one. I don't know about you guys. The first time I saw my long form birth certificate was when I had to try out for basketball in high school. So I was, I think, like a sophomore in high school before I actually laid eyes on it. Most people, if they do have a birth certificate, they have that little wallet card, which only has some abbreviated information, as opposed to your long form birth certificate, which has some additional information on it, including your mom's name, your dad's name, etc. Now, as I said, the people who have this issue have ongoing problems getting all types of assistance or things that are necessary, even something as basic as medication, picking up a prescription. Certainly, if it's any sort of opioid-based or narcotic-based medication, you can't pick that up in most cases. If it's prescribed, you can't pick it up without a photo ID. And in some instances, if it's over the counter, you can't get it without a photo ID. There are people who cannot schedule surgeries because they don't have a photo ID, and that is because they don't have a birth certificate. There are people who qualify for public benefits, whether it's housing, food assistance, SNAP benefits, Medicaid, anything that's need-based. They will have difficulty getting those benefits or completing the application process for those benefits if they cannot provide their birth certificate and or a photo ID. In most instances, in all instances, they usually need the photo ID. In many instances, they need both the photo ID and the birth certificate, and many of them are just not in a position to do it because it doesn't exist. And a lot of times they don't know it until they need it.
Hey, Sheila, I don't want to interrupt, but I'm not seeing your slides advance.
I'm sorry.
So,
okay, let me go past that.
There
one.
we go.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Now, most of the people, oh, sorry, Susie, are you done? Sorry.
Yeah, we see it now. Thank you.
Many of the people who have these issues are they're generally poor, they're elderly, and they're minorities. And they also many of them live in the southern states. There is a reason that many of the minorities that have this issue, and it's typically because, and they're typically in a certain age range. They're usually older than 50. Many of them were born before desegregation. They were either didn't have access to hospitals or they could not get to a hospital if they were able to be admitted to a hospital to give birth. And so many times their birth happened at home and they were delivered by a midwife, and that's not a certified midwife that you might know of today or a doula or anything of the sort. It may be their grandmother, it may be their aunt, it may be the lady next door who just has who has experience in attending the birth of children. And when someone goes into labor, someone runs and gets this woman, and she comes in and helps deliver the baby. Now, many of the home births were not accompanied by a completion of documentation to register the birth of that child, and that is not necessarily because of lack of effort of the midwife. A lot of times, many states, particularly in the South, it just wasn't a priority to make sure that home births, particularly of minorities, was documented. That's just a fact. And so consequently, there are people who have reached a certain age who honestly were never aware that they had this issue until they tried to access a number of benefits. Typically, Social Security is the first thing that pops up, because when they try to get their Social Security benefits and they can't produce that birth certificate, or the birth certificate has different information on it than what they've lived their whole lives to know, whether it's the name of a parent or their own name or their own birth date. If there's any inconsistencies in those records, or if they can't produce that birth certificate, many times they'll have trouble completing that application process to qualify for their Social Security, retirement, or disability benefits. And they just didn't know it before that point. And that's not because they just never had a use for it, because you have to understand that in many cases, it just wasn't required. There are people who have served in the military. There are people who've traveled abroad. There are people who've worked their entire lives who never had a birth certificate, and it wasn't an issue until relatively recently, and relatively means primarily after 9/11, and I'll get to that in just a few minutes. Now, I recall reading, and I couldn't locate this article. I remember printing it out, but in 2010, the Charleston Post and Courier had a front page article on this issue, and the estimate in the article was that there could be as many at that time as 250,000 South Carolinians who may have been born without their births being registered with the state registrar. And without a birth certificate, these citizens usually cannot, as I said, obtain, some of them can't get hired on a job. They can't access their Social Security benefits. They can't get prescribed medication. They can't have surgery, access housing, can't open bank accounts. I had a client who walked around with his initial Social Security benefit check of $7,000 or $8,000 for almost a year because he couldn't cash it, because he couldn't open a bank account, because he didn't have a photo ID, because he didn't have a birth certificate. So there you go. They can't board planes or even inner city buses without a picture ID. So it is complicated for these people to do just basic, take care of personal business, to move about their lives, handle their personal business, attend to their health care, try to obtain housing, try to get employment. It is, if they have this issue, because it is more difficult now to function in life without a birth certificate, it is a major hindrance to getting even sometimes the most basic services. Okay. Oops. All right. Now, I remember when I first started practicing law, I'm not going to date myself and tell you how long that was ago, but I remember back in the day, it was just a matter of getting an attorney, and I think maybe some people did it per se or file these packets themselves, submitting it to a family court judge, because the family court in South Carolina has jurisdiction of these cases. If you have to file a court action, you submit that packet with some affidavits and some other documentation, and a family court judge would sign an order requiring the state registrar at Vital Records Agency at DHEC to create your birth certificate. Well, all of that got really, really difficult, especially after 9/11. And the primary reason for that is that one of the things that the federal authorities determined when they were investigating how these hijackers got their identifications that allowed them to buy plane tickets and board these planes was that they had an incredibly easy time obtaining counterfeit IDs. And they all had, some of them had multiple IDs from multiple states. And the one thing that the federal authorities noticed was that there was no uniformity among these identification cards. They didn't have the same information. And if you think about it, a driver's license from one state to another, I probably have seen maybe half the states in the country just based on filing these cases. They essentially have the same information on it. They've got your date of birth, they've got the state where you live, your address, your photo, and a little bit more demographic information that really doesn't change from state to state. So one of the things that happened after 9/11 was that Congress passed a federal law to correct this issue and to essentially create a national ID in the form of a state-issued driver's license from state to state, or a state-issued identification card that had essentially the same information on it. The ID card here in South Carolina, I forgot to include a copy of one or sample in this presentation, but the ID in South Carolina has a gold star on the license or on the ID card. That is an indication that it complies with the federal law, and the vetting and the documentation that's needed, that's additional to the documentation that you have to provide when you go to the DMV to get your driver's license or to get an identification card. That document or that ID is called a real ID because it complies with the federal requirements of providing certain documentation in order to get that, I guess, enhanced or bumped up ID card or driver's license, and allows you to travel, to board commercial airliners, to travel abroad, to enter federal buildings, excuse me, and so forth. You can still use a regular driver's license. You just are limited in terms of the use of that driver's license. You wouldn't be able to do any of that stuff I just mentioned in most federal facilities, military bases, airplanes, that sort of thing. So you can still function with a regular driver's license, but if you ever hope to travel abroad or to board a plane or to do some of these other things, then most people are in the process of trying to get the Real ID. South Carolina is one of the states that is not yet in full compliance. We're in the process of becoming compliant. They have started to issue, the South Carolina Department of Motor Vehicles has started the process of issuing Real IDs. They've tried to make it as easy as possible, but the issue of a lack of birth certificate makes it more difficult for people to accomplish this. The Real ID deadline was originally October of 2021. Then it was extended to May of 2022, or maybe March of 2022. And now it has been extended because of the pandemic to May 3rd of 2023. So after May 3rd of 2023, today, if you needed a plane ticket to go someplace, you could use your state issued ID or driver's license just as it is. But as of May 3rd of 2023, you gotta have that little gold star because you will have had to comply with the enhanced documentation that's needed to get that. And so there are lots of people who are scrambling to get that done. And a lot of those people can't even approach that issue until they get their birth certificate. Now, there is an administrative process for doing this, and essentially it allows you to go to the agency, take essentially proof of any birth fact, any piece of information that is going to appear on your birth certificate. You have to have some sort of documentation of it. And you can go to the agency. I'm not quite sure what the percentage is of people who can actually get this done administratively. But judging by the volume and the number of people who come, at least to my office, and in general who have this issue, I would think that there are quite a few people that cannot get this done administratively. That is usually not because they don't have some sort of documentation, but it's more likely because there are inconsistencies in the documents. Because a few slides forward, there's a list of some documents that you can use to try to document your birth facts. And many times, just in my anecdotal experience of doing these cases, there are many inconsistencies. Usually it has to do with the spelling of your name. Sometimes it is the actual day of your birth. Sometimes it's the month. Sometimes it's the year. And those are material inconsistencies that the agency is just not going to take your word for. As one of the attorneys from the general counsel's office once told a judge told me after a hearing that he asked the attorney why they were so adamant in opposing the issuance of a birth certificate for a lady whose case was before the court in another county. And the attorney told the judge that the agency had to preserve the sanctity of their records. There's air quotes around that. And, he said, well, the applicable statute gives me the authority to issue the birth certificate or issue an order requiring you to issue the birth certificate. So that's what I'm going to do. I will say, and I'll get to the court process shortly, that, as I said, jurisdiction for these cases in the family court. Family court judges are extremely sympathetic to these cases. Every once in a while, you'll encounter a judge who's not familiar with this statute. So I always take a copy of the statute for the judge and maybe a summary of it. But for the most part, if you check the boxes on the statute, the judge will issue the order. And you'll see in the process to file the court action that the registrar has to be served, and they may or may not attend the hearing. Most often they do not. Sometimes that can be a problem. I'll explain that to you in a little bit. But if you're going to do the administrative process, you need to make sure that the documents that you have prove your birth facts. When you get there, you're going to have to fill out that birth certificate application to ask for your birth certificate. The purpose of that, and I think it's like $12 for one. You would only really need to apply for one at that point. The purpose of that is to generate a search of the registrar's records for your birth record. If they don't find your birth record, the registrar will issue something called a not found letter. And I have a copy of that a few slides forward, and I'll show it to you in just a few minutes. But if you are able to do it, the information that you generally need are just basic birth facts, your name at birth and any name changes. And there's a little caveat to that I'll tell you about in a little bit, because if there have been name changes, you might need a combination of a delayed birth certificate action and a name change or amendment action. And so you need a couple of statutes mushed together to get to accomplish what you need. Your gender, any gender changes, there again, you may need a change and a delayed birth certificate. Your county of birth, your mother's name prior to any marriages, and the name of your biological father. Now, your mother's maiden name is a piece of information that they just cannot conduct the search without. And I've had clients come in who don't know their mother's name, or who were raised by someone that they thought was their mother, and they found out later that this person wasn't their mother, but raised them as though they were their own. And sometimes that can cause some difficulty in obtaining and conducting the search and obtaining an accurate not found letter as to whether or not you really don't have a record. I think for some people, I'm not quite sure what the percentage would be, they actually have a birth record, but the information that they've always known to be birth facts related to their birth doesn't match the information that's in the registrar's records. And occasionally when people go get their birth record searched, the registrar will say, well, I think I found your birth record, but it's not what you're telling me. So you're going to need to go get a lawyer, and you're going to need to file something to get a court-ordered delayed birth certificate. And that could be very frustrating for a lot of these people. Many times they've been back and forth to the agency. They've applied multiple times. They've paid the fee multiple times. And it's just sort of a tail chasing kind of thing. They're told sometimes, bring this back, go get some school records, go get some employment records. What the agency is looking for is the earliest possible record of your existence. So, early elementary school. There's something, and I'll get to it, it's in a list a couple of slides forward, something called the Numinate report that's issued by, it's an extracted report, an abstract of the first time your Social Security card was applied for. Pretty innocuous looking. It's not on Social Security letterhead. It's about a quarter of a page that just has your birth facts on it, basically. And it usually reflects the first time your Social Security card was applied for. And for the most part, both the agency and the family court judges take those that document as definitive proof, unless there's inconsistencies. And there are people who have inconsistencies for a number of different reasons. So if you approach the agency and you want to do this administratively, or you want them to issue your birth certificate with the information that you have, and they determine either that they first determine that they can't find your record, they then look at your documentation, and they're looking to see if there are inconsistencies in your records. And if there are, they're not going to issue the birth record. One of the things that will cause them, depending on when you were born, to not issue the record and to require you to get a court order is that you may have your parents' name correct, first and last, including your mother's maiden name, but you may not have evidence that your parents were married at the time you were born. And depending on when that happened, the statute doesn't exist anymore, but if your birth occurred within, and I can't recall what the cutoff date is, before a certain date, you essentially have to prove that you were not born out of wedlock in order for the registrar to issue your birth certificate with your father's name on it. Even if you've used your father's surname your entire life, they will most likely issue the birth record with your mother's maiden name and list your father as your father. So if you have an issue, people can see that this is your mom with her maiden name, and then this is your dad's name. But if that inconsistency exists, or if you can't confirm or prove with some other documentation that your parents were married when you were born, depending on when that was, they may tell you you're going to need a court order, because you got to establish that by presenting, filing the case and presenting evidence to the court. So what you're looking at now on the left is the Vital Records birth application. This is what you're going to fill out to start everything. Notice up at the top right here where it's, I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing, where it says that application without proper identification will be returned unprocessed. So if you don't have an ID, it's probably not going to be a good use of your time to mail this in. You certainly can mail it in, obviously, because you can see with the instructions down here where you would mail it in. But if you don't put your ID, a copy of your ID in with this application, they will send it back to you without even attempting to process it because the ID is required. If you must mail it in, or you prefer to at least mail it in to try to see if you can get it before you have to, go and speak to a lawyer, then you can apply for your birth certificate. Your parent can, your legal guardian, your legal representative, i.e. your lawyer, or other. Now, that could be, I'm guessing, maybe a foster parent or some other person, maybe a penal institution. Maybe they're trying to confirm for their records what your date of birth is. So in that other space, it could be a number of people, but it can't just be, extended family, random people, your best friend. Just anybody cannot apply for your birth certificate. And if you notice right there, also, you have to explain what the purpose is that you're requesting the certificate for, which is interesting because you just want a copy of your birth certificate. Why do you have to tell them? Why do they care why you want your birth certificate? But anyway, you do have to indicate a reason. You also, if you notice in the next block down here, you see that you have to put your full, middle, and last name, your date of birth, your gender, your city of birth, your county of birth, the name of your mother before any marriages, the name of your father before any marriages, and that's because some men change their surnames to match their wives' surnames. Your mother or parents' state of birth and your father or parents' state of birth. Here's this question that could cause you to get bounced to a lawyer. Were your parents married at the time of birth? And if you answer no, then if they decide to either issue it by court order or by administrative assistance, they're most likely going to issue your birth certificate in your mother's maiden name, using your mother's maiden name as your last name, even if you use your dad's name your whole life. Also, here, the number of children born to your mother in South Carolina. This question usually, depending on what you put in that block, what they're sometimes looking for is sequencing, like a birth order, to try to see if they can follow the birth order. If you indicate that you have two older siblings, two younger siblings, they want to see if there was enough. Honestly, because this has been an issue in one of my cases, gestational time, enough time for a pregnancy, two pregnancies to not occur within the same possible gestational period. I had a case with a gentleman who needed to file. He'd been in the military. He was the youngest of probably 11 or 12 children. And when I filed this action for him, I was truly shocked to get back a response from DHEC asking the family court to deny his request because their record showed that he had a female sibling, if his other information was accurate, that was born within 2 or 3 months of his date of birth. And that wasn't medically possible. And we had to do something funky with, with his birth facts, but still be as accurate as possible, still make sure we didn't bump into any issues with Social Security overpayments if he started getting benefits earlier than the stated date of his birthday. All kinds of funky stuff happened with that, but we were able to resolve it. But that just goes to show you, sometimes I think in his case, what happened was his sibling beat him to either to the agency or to the courthouse, because I think most of his siblings were born at home. Some of them were more attentive to this issue as possible, or they moved quicker to get their birth documented. And whatever the birth date was that they thought was always their birth date was probably without giving a thought to the sequencing and the number of months or years between the birth of their older or younger sibling. Once that birth record was issued, then that made it difficult for a subsequent sibling who was born too close above them or too close below them to get their birth certificate issued, and they had to do some acrobatics to get that done. The next document that you see right next to the application of a birth certificate, this is the let's go back to that. This letter is the not found letter. Some of them are longer and they have a list of things where if the agency thinks they can do this administratively, they'll give some additional instructions. But this is basically the letter that explains exactly what the agency found when they conducted your birth record based on what you put in this birth certificate application. So if you look, they're going to do a diligent search of the statewide birth indexes, and they are searching generally 10 years before and 10 years after your stated birth, date of birth. And they find they indicate that no record was located after they did this search for under your mother's name and under your name, because those are the two primary pieces of information that they need. Usually there is a raised seal on this letter, and this is the letter. If you know someone who has to have this done, or if you have this done yourself, you need to hold on to this letter, because if they determine they can't do your birth certificate administratively, then you have to file a court action in family court to get a family court to issue an order. By statute, this letter has to be attached to that petition to get that order. So, and it also cannot be more than 2 years older than your petition. So if you file your petition today, this particular letter cannot be older than February 22nd of 2019. If it's older than that, then you need to complete the application again and generate a newer, for lack of a better word, not found letter in order for the agency not to object to you using it when you file your petition, because it's too old per statute. Now, when you do the administrative, when you attempt the administrative process, you have to provide the minimum prescribed documentation, satisfactory as to validity, to the state registrar. Sometimes it seems like it's arbitrary, but I guess it's really a matter of what it is that they're looking at when they look at these documents. And what I did was I put a list of documents, suggested documents that you can assemble to present to the agency to ask the agency to create your birth record. And these different types of records would have your birth facts for the most part, or some piece of birth fact that they need, and they may take multiple records and put them together to indicate that they're satisfied that you are who you say you are, because that's essentially what you're doing. You're proving that you exist and that all the facts that you know about yourself in terms of when and where you were born and who your parents are are true. And unless they're persuaded, they're just not going to do it. So if you look at number one, it's the Social Security Numinate printout. There's a copy of an application to get that done. You can only get it from the Social Security Administration. Generally, you cannot get it from a local Social Security office. You have to send the request up to their FOIA office. I believe in Baltimore, Maryland. The address is on the form. I'll get to it. And that form may have been updated, but I could not access the updated form. Your Social Security award letter generally has some of your birth facts on it. School records, especially elementary records, are very useful unless they have inconsistent information. And I've seen school records that have constant inconsistencies for people who have been either adopted or informally or formally, or people who've been in prison. And in some instances, I've had both. And those poor people just have I guess, foster home to foster home. There wasn't a lot of attention paid to, the person taking the information from either the parent or the child was giving incorrect information because they didn't know the correct information, and they didn't know the correct information. Or back in the day when children went to school for the first time, especially prior to desegregation, a lot of times they were taken to school on their first day of school, not by their parent, but by an older sibling who was already in school. And that child may or may not have known the correct spelling. They may or may not have been, literate enough to give the accurate information for their younger sibling. And that information was recorded in the school records, and those school records then, you use those to create the record. And you know, when people present these records, they see the inconsistencies, but they think they're inconsequential, but they're not to the agency. Marriage licenses and/or your marriage certificates, divorce decrees, your high school diploma, your college degrees, your children's long form birth certificates, because it generally has your, even if it's your married name for women, and for men, it has your name on your child's birth certificate, especially if your child was born and they're older than 18 and you're over 50. It's very useful to use your child's long form birth certificate. Passports, including expired passports, your voter registration card, almost to a person, every person whose case I've ever done, with the exception of I think 2 people, had a voter registration card. So that meant they were able to register to vote without any issue, without a photo ID, and many of them held those cards for years. Hunting and fishing licenses, insurance records, bank records, military records, including and especially your DD-214, when you discharge from whatever military branch you're in, and the documentation, any documentation of veterans benefits from the VA, expired identification cards of any sort, driver's licenses from any state. These are the forms of information that I've used to file cases. So I would imagine if you could present these documents to the agency, they may use some of these. My guess is they probably would not utilize any expired IDs, even if it's your ID, which is bizarre, but okay. ID cards for public benefits, college ID cards, etc. Arrest records. Arrest records are extremely accurate. For the most part, they're more accurate than most public records, so they're helpful. And I have had clients who've had arrest records in the past. It's just that when you, especially if they're getting a name change, or any portion of their case involves changing their name or correcting their name, you just have to send a copy of the court order to the appropriate state agency to show that there was a correction on their identity to comply, to make sure it comports with what's in their records. Your income tax records, your W-2 forms, baptismal records. Baptismal records, the Vital Records Agency is not always receptive to them. I guess they don't consider them to be reliable, but the family court judges sure do. So if they see a Bible record, if it looks authentic to them, they're more likely going to rely on it. Census records, those are just a few of the records that you can present, and these are also useful in filing your case. So if you try to do it administratively and you have these records, you should assemble them. I would suggest, and sometimes I'll look at a client when they come in and I'll say, I think you might be able to get this done administratively, especially if they're in a hurry and they have a whole bunch of documentation. I will suggest to them that they arrange the records chronologically, put them in a nice folder, tab them, fill out their birth certificate application, and take themselves in person, as opposed to mailing this into the Vital Records Agency, not in the county where they were born, but at the State Registrar's office in Columbia, and ask for the agency to consider administratively issuing their birth record. If you have a sibling that's close in age to you that can vouch for your age and give some information that the agency might find useful, I would take them with me if they are able to go with you. I've had clients who've brought siblings who could do that for them. But by and large, many of these people are too old to have living siblings or living relatives and people who may have been around when they were born. I've had a few. I've had one woman whose 94-year-old mother came from New York to testify as her witness in my case, to verify that this was her daughter and that she had her when she was 14 years old. And basically that was enough for the family court judge to issue the order. And again, down here, older records sometimes contain errors and inconsistencies. Especially spelling of the name, it could be something very, very simple, or what looks like it's very simple to you. You may say, well, my name is spelled S-H-E-I-L-A and not S-H-I-E-L-A. And that may be true, but if that's the case and they have records with the name spelled 2 different ways, they're not going to fix that administratively. They're going to make you file the court case to get the judge to issue an order for the correct spelling and include that information in the order. Okay, so next, this is the process for obtaining a birth certificate by court order. The first thing you have to do with that trustee not found letter in your hand is, and this can be done pro se, filing it yourself. In my informal discussions with family court judges on these cases, most judges think that lay people have a difficult time navigating this process on a pro se basis. More recently, I've seen some younger people who are even, and not because they're younger, just because their error is something that seems obvious. Like there are some common spellings of certain names where you can see that an N should have been an A based on how what the client says their name is. And occasionally you'll see the agency correct that. I had a young woman come in one time where her child's middle name was misspelled. There was an apostrophe after the first letter of his middle name, and it should have been before. So the apostrophe needed to be moved over one letter, and the agency wouldn't do it administratively. And I, called general counsel and I said, I'm gonna file this case if I have to, but it's not gonna make the judge happy. And you guys are not fond of coming into court, but I'm gonna tell you right now, the judge I know is gonna make you come to court and explain why you didn't fix this administratively. So they fixed it. The first thing you do is you file a petition for a delayed birth certificate with that not found letter attached. The petition is filed in the family court in the county where the petitioner lives. If the petitioner is no longer living in South Carolina, a court of competent jurisdiction in the state where the petitioner lives can issue an order. I have not seen a whole lot of orders from other states, but I have done actions for people born in other states here in South Carolina. And what you essentially do is you explain to the client before you file that I can do this for you. I will review the statute in the receiving state, and I will ask the family court here or ask the court through the order issued by my family court judge to give the order that I obtained for the client full faith and credit. In other words, treat it like it's an order issued in the state that it needs to be enforced in. Most states will do that. And it could be that the reason I haven't seen people who've done the reverse is because they're able to get it done directly with the agency. I'm not sure about that, but that's what I suspect. Let's see. The petition has to have the petitioner's name at birth, any name changes, and right here is where I included the information that if there was a name change, or if you found out during the process that your name wasn't what you thought it was and you wanted to fix it or something of that nature, then you may need what I would call a hybrid case, not just a delayed birth certificate, but also an amendment or a correction of your birth record may also need to be done at the same time. So and I'm not going to go into the name change or correction or amendment statutes. It'll just probably muddy things up. We'll save that for another day. Also must contain your gender or any gender changes. If there were gender changes, then you probably need that combination again of a name change and a delayed action, or gender change, some sort of amendment to your birth record along with the delayed birth record. Your date of birth, your county of birth, your mother's full name prior to any marriages, the full name of your biological father. All of that has to be in your petition. Petition also must allege that you were born in South Carolina, that no record of your birth exists, and that you were unable to provide the minimum required documentation. That sounds like a slam, but it's really not. It just means whatever the documentation is wasn't sufficient for the agency to do it administratively, so you need a court order where you have to testify and or provide additional documentation to get the order to get the agency to do it. The certified copy of the petition after it's filed has to be served on the registrar. We serve the general counsel for DHEC for that at least 30 days before a scheduled hearing. The statute says that a hearing may be held. Most of the time in these cases, there is a hearing, but I have had cases where a judge was willing to sign my order on my pleading, on my complaint, or my petition rather, because I, depending on the circumstances, I will front load my petition and attach all of my documentation to the petition. So when I guess when the court's reviewing the cases coming up for hearing, either I'll get a call from the judge's secretary saying, Ms. Thomas, judge says submit a proposed order, send it to DHEC, Vital Records, let them look at it. And if they don't have any issue with it, send it in and she'll sign the order. Or I will get to the hearing and the judge will say, good morning, we have a little chat about the weather. And then the judge will say, Ms. Thomas, I'm gonna sign the order without taking a word of testimony. I've had that happen multiple times where my client came from out of state, but they were still glad. Let's see. Okay, now I'm gonna fast forward just a minute to illustrate this next point in terms of what the documentation that's used in court to get the delayed birth certificate has to be listed and specified in the court order itself and on this form. Let me fast forward to it. This here, DHEC form 615A. This is basically your birth certificate. If you get a delayed birth certificate, it's not going to look like birth certificates that other people have. If you look at it, it's going to have the court where the case was filed. It's going to show the docket number from the case where your action was filed, the full name, the petitioner at birth, the name if it was changed by the court, your date of birth, your gender, all of your birth facts is going to be on this document, the same as it would on a regular birth certificate, but it's just arranged in a different order. And then it requires the signature of the judge. And right in this blank space here, it's going to be a very detailed list of every piece of documentation or every exhibit or anything that you offer to the court to prove that this person was who they say they are. It has to be listed very, very explicitly right in this section. It is a fillable form, so that's fairly easy to do and, without, kind of messing it up. Because this form, there can't be any whiteouts, there can't be any scratch outs, any corrections on this form when it's submitted to DHEC, or they will reject it. And you'll have to, do it again, use the fillable form and send it back to the judge for another signature, because if there are any extraneous marks on it, they will not use it. This form here, is the numinate request that goes to the FOIA office, the Freedom of Information office in Baltimore. That's the only place you can send this to get your numinate report. Again, you can't send it to the local Social Security office. Let me go back to where it was. Okay. And this is just a sort of a truncated version of the statute that I really sort of just set out in the bullet points a couple of slides back. And that is basically it. Now, once you get that, once you get the court order and the form 615A both go to DHEC with another application for a birth certificate. And then the agency will return the birth certificate on their on the special paper that they use with the raised seal and the registrar's signature and all the information. So it's really important that that form have the information accurately reflected and the pieces of evidence that are used, because you don't want it going back and forth between, to DHEC and or to the judge because, there's a whiteout mark or something like that on it. And that is basically it for the legal process and the administrative process. And if anybody has any questions, fire away.
Okay, Sheila, that was great. I see that so far none of our viewers have put a question in the question box, but I invite them to do that now. If you can go to the slide with all of our contact information on it, I can talk a little bit about that for a minute as we're signing off, and I'll keep an eye on that question box just in case. But I want to thank you for a great presentation. That's probably why there aren't any questions yet. It was very detailed and kind of laid out the process. So excellent. Thanks so much. And I want to say to our audience, if you found this helpful and someone else may find it helpful as well that's having an issue like this, please do go to our YouTube channel tomorrow at SC Legal Services, and you'll find this broadcast on the Level Up Law playlist, and you can share it to whomever you like. We definitely want as many people as possible to get important information like this. And while you're there, be sure to like and subscribe for more, so you can get alerts. You can sign up for notifications so you're alerted every time we post an episode. And also you can put comments below the presentation and let us know if it was helpful or if there's other subjects that you would like to hear about. We will be continuing our conversation next week on Level Up Law. We'll be having attorney Charlotte Osmer, who will actually be talking about those gender markers that Sheila mentioned. She'll be going over and explaining the process of actually getting a change in the gender marker on your birth certificate, which is sort of another process in the same process that Sheila's been talking about. So be sure to go over to our calendar at fclegal.org to register for that one, or you can also register on our Facebook page. And you'll see here on the screen all the information about how to apply for our services. You can apply by phone, which is Monday through Thursday, 9 to 6. We have great intake specialists who will take your information, and we'll see if you qualify for our services, and we can help you out. You can also apply online, which is 24/7, so that's an easy way to do it. But we have a lot of resources out there for you, so be sure and check out all of the resources that we have as listed here, with all those connections that you can make. Well, Sheila, again, it looks like you did such a great job that none of our audience has put any questions in. So thank you so much again for a great presentation. Thanks to our audience for tuning in. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week for another Level Up Law episode on Tuesday at noon. Thanks for tuning in. That concludes the broadcast.
Thanks, y'all.